Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, managing editor at Town Hall, and today I'm joined by...
Robby Soave, staff editor at Reason.
Yeah, thanks for being with me today, Robby. I wanted to talk a little bit about civil rights and policing and punishment and kind of the aftermath and policy repercussions from kind of a right-of-center, libertarian-ish perspective of what's happened in Ferguson and the Eric Garner killing. There's a lot, obviously, that's been written online. Reason has done a really good job of covering it from a libertarian perspective. But I wanted to ask you, how you think there might be momentum for reform in these tragedies. We're seeing protests crop up all across the country. What policy might be able to come out of this, and kind of what are libertarians focusing on with regard to what this kind of momentum can achieve?
Well, I think you're seeing, when these cases happen, they're not always perfect vehicles for one reform or the other. So, we're seeing things like what happened in Ferguson, but we're broadly talking about, I think, things that Rand Paul is bringing to the forefront, like, ramping down mandatory minimum sentencing a bit, doing cameras on police vehicles, on cops. I think, we're hoping to ramp down the drug war in some meaningful way. And I think, those things would be very, very big changes that would do a lot of good in a lot of these cases, but that's not to say that, it would fix everything that's gone wrong or that it would have done something necessarily in the Michael Brown case. But I think libertarians are using these examples that have upset everyone. And I see Rand Paul doing a lot of that, to say this is an injustice, and there's so much, there's injustice actually at the policy level. And if we could reform some of these things, things would be a lot better for a lot of people. Not that it might have helped in this specific case, but I think those are the big things they want to talk about. I think, particularly the sentencing is just so out of whack, and the drug war relating to that needs to be ramped down so that we're not going after people for these low-level nonviolent offenses. We're not throwing them in jail forever, and we're not crowding our prisons. And I think that is a very marketable message to conservatives and liberals. So I see a lot of very positive progress on this issue in recent months and last year or two or three. So I'm excited, though those things seem to be making some progress.
I mean, that sounds a lot, like you said, it's something marketable and something that liberals and some conservatives, not all conservatives, can agree on. But it seems to me like that's an issue that's kind of tangential to what actually occurred in Ferguson. The story is that the reason that Dorian Johnson couldn't have called the cops was that they had marijuana on them, and they were concerned about that. But that seems very tangential at best to what happened, and I'm not sure. There's certainly momentum for drug war reforms and sentencing reforms, but at best, like I said, I'm not sure that that's something that really appeals on a trans-ideological level in this situation. I mean, it seems a lot more accurate, I suppose, to focus more on police abuses, I suppose, reforming the grand jury process, dealing with how prosecutors approach that, and certainly about racial discrepancies on police forces, especially in marginalized communities like in Ferguson. So I'm not sure how the drug war really fits into these cases. And I mean, we look at Rand Paul, and some of the things that he said seem a little reaching for the policy implications here.
Well, I think the problem with going straight to those sorts of, there are absolutely things I would like to fix about police departments. There's no question that, there are bad actors who can get away with a lot in police departments because of the incentive structure. I think those things are hard, frankly, to tack on like a policy level. You can't just pass a law and say, okay, no more racism in police departments. It's a sort of like a cultural attitude shift in some way that I think, kind of occurs over time, and I'm not sure like the best thing to do. I mean, I think specifically in Ferguson, mandated police cameras and dash cams would be like the closest thing to, would have made that, would have ameliorated that problem. But you're gonna have instances like what happened in Ferguson where you're not going to have a perfect, and it's outraged a lot of people. I think it was not actually the best case for like police brutality reform because there was a lot of conflicting testimony, and we don't really get to choose the news stories that resonate with people, that get people really up in arms, as that one did. Even though I think what happened to like Timmy Rice and Eric Garner are much clearer cases of injustice where you could really build a reform movement around, and people are very interested in those cases as well, obviously. But what we saw coming out of Ferguson, I think it's harder to make that into a test case for let's do this policy change. And I see what you're saying. I get the criticism of these big loftier things, but I do think that those are specific policies we could do that have some across the aisle appeal that would, I think, discharge the police brutality state significantly. And, I see them mattering more to people. And I think Rand Paul is making like a lot of good strides on that stuff. And, so are other people. So I do think that's a valid approach.
Right. I would agree. We don't get, like you said, we don't get to choose what stories become these monumental and momentous flashpoints that actually mobilize people to care about some of these issues. And like you said, at least as someone who works for a conservative site, reads what our readers and writers have to say, the Michael Brown case is not a quote unquote perfect one because there have been there's a lot of conflict into what actually happened. So I think you're right. Talking about the Eric Garner case seems a lot more clear cut. We have actual video of what happened there, and it's pretty horrifying to actually know what happened. So, and one of the things that I think comes out of that is, that was filmed, and something that I've seen at least probably has some of the most cross-ideological appeals, the idea of forcing the police force to wear body cameras, more dash cams for cop cars, and things like that. But I'm not entirely sure there's even momentum for that as a fairly, small incremental reform. Just yesterday or a couple days ago, I think the Illinois legislature passed another law. A previous law that they had passed had been struck down by the Illinois Supreme Court, saying that citizens should not be allowed to record police. And Illinois isn't exactly, a state run by conservatives with a high deference to authority, who are big fans of policing and justice and pretty hard, very strict crime and punishment type people. So it seems like even some of these reforms might be difficult to build momentum for.
Yeah, I think they're very difficult to build momentum for. And, it's true that, sometimes it ends up being like a people in power versus regular people issue, not a partisan or an ideological issue. And I think to some extent that's true in a lot of places with something like mandating cameras. Like it's something that regular people, that citizens are going to be interested in, but the people in the government are always going to be pushing back against because, maybe in often cases because they have police groups lobbying them not to do that, which I think is unfortunate. I do think, I think one argument that should be made to sort of get police on the side of this is that cameras, will absolutely help police, help protect them when they actually are doing the right thing, and they can't prove that. And, we're seeing all this anger about what police are doing. There are probably some police who, when they have to do something controversial, it would be great if they were mandated to have cameras and you could show, like, look what this person had to do. I think that's the best way to market it, is to say, this isn't some anti-cop policy. This is something, this is about protecting them too from false or malicious accusations, or blowback from something they had to do. It's just a good policy all around, and I think regular people do like it. It's more about convincing the government class to get on board, which, uphill battle on everything, and it's not. I don't think it's about to sweep the nation tomorrow, and we're just going to have this mandated in every department and it'll be all squared away. Definitely, but I think there are arguments to be made for it that are quite persuasive.
Right. I think there's a huge cultural issue at play here, in that, Americans in general, and, I'm not innocent of this either, love kind of crime and justice procedurals in which the cops and agents of the state are portrayed as very good actors in the system. Shows like Cops and Law and Order and NCIS, and you can go on and on with those, but they portray the criminal justice system as effectively just and run by good actors. So I think that there's a very strong bias on the part of Americans to trust our criminal justice system and trust the actors within it. So that's a huge roadblock in getting, accountability into our justice system for cops, for prosecutors, to make sure that they are effectively doing their jobs for the people and not just for themselves. And on the other side of body cams, because I would say that kind of holding police accountable for injustice is something that generally aligns as a left-wing issue, as far as, it's not the deference to authority prior that conservatives typically have. On the other side, I think that there's been a fairly significant acknowledgement on the part of a lot of progressive writers that police unions are doing disservice to justice here. And that's what I would say is probably one of the motivating factors behind a lot of incumbent legislators who are against some of these accountability measures, is that the police unions, unions in general, are still a very powerful political force in America. And police unions do have significant sway with members of legislatures across the country. So I think that's probably some package of reforms centered on holding police accountable and fighting against police unions is going to be something that appeals to the grassroots on both sides of the aisle here.
Absolutely. And if you look at the Eric Garner, video footage, if you look at like what his and we at Reason wrote a little article, about his last words, like it really struck me as sort of a conservative, it could be like a Tea Party message even. He was saying, you keep pushing me around, please stop. I'm not doing anything. I can't breathe. And then they killed him for it. And it's a very, to me, it's almost a don't tread on me sort of thing. Like he was just being pushed around by the government. And I think, there are a lot of ways in which that message appeals to conservatives, that the government is pushing people around. It's getting bigger. They don't like that. And there's always been that challenge in getting, I think, the right to see police and policing as, one government program among many that they should also be a little skeptical of. And I think this case is doing that to some degree. So I do think there's that there's that cross appeal, and like you said, talking about the police union issue, which is sort of, I think, been historically a tough sell for the left because they're so pro-union, but you have been seeing, you're right. I think I saw in Jacobin something about how police unions have been very, very, very bad for progressive causes. So I think there is an admitting truth moment happening there on both sides, hopefully, and that you would actually get some support for some of these things because of that.
Right. I mean, I don't remember where it was that I saw it. I might have been Jacobin, but someone they said, we don't let the American military unionize. Why do we let the American police force unionize? And that, to me, kind of aligns it more with a left-wing issue, because I would say the left wing is more skeptical of the power that the military wields than they are of, domestic unions. And I don't think that there's a huge push for military members to be able to form a union, even though, the progressives prior might be that labor power and unionization is generally a force for good. We don't see that with the military, and I think that some are trying to pull that into the domestic sphere with the issue of police unions. I did want to talk about the Eric Garner case because, and specifically what Rand Paul had to say, a lot of progressives kind of mocked Rand Paul for coming out and saying that a large part of the Garner killing was due to government high cigarette taxes. And that, to me, is trying to push it into a sphere where conservatives and libertarians are a little more comfortable discussing rather than race issues, to say that it's a problem of, high government taxes, which is a frequent complaint of people on the right with many societal issues. But do you find merit in that aspect of the Garner killing?
Oh yeah, there is undoubtedly merit in this aspect, and it does annoy many on the left, and that's unfortunate. But I mean, they have to admit it, and I will argue with anyone I come across. But this absolutely, this gives an excuse to police to bother people, and it's not that it's just cigarettes; it's that a million things are illegal on the streets of New York, and there's just a total culture of over-criminalization, and that's what lies at the heart of police power, and the left has to understand that these people are enforcing actual laws. That's what they're doing, and obviously they're not going to take it to this extreme every time, but they have a legitimate reason to when you criminalize absolutely everything. So it's not about cigarettes specifically, but cigarettes is a good example. A very punishing tax on the poorest of the poor. Because they're the people who smoke in higher rates. This is paying for some sort of progressive, tax goal or system of, I guess, deterring them from smoking or something. But it's terrible, and that's what underscores all this police bad acting is actually bad laws to enforce. So I think Rand Paul's point was totally valid. We have too many laws on the books. And that comes into play when they're looking to charge people with stuff. They can always find out that you violated some law. Your hat was like the wrong size or something. Something totally ridiculous is on the books all the time. This comes into play a lot of the time, and it might sort of relate to Tamir Rice. When I cover a lot of schools and education policy and things that kids get arrested for or expelled from classes for that are totally ridiculous, that people just overreacting to things they have, that they have fishing supplies in their car, or that they, the kid that chewed his Pop-Tart in the shape of a gun and he was in trouble. It's just like a total culture of alarmism and over-criminalization that we've developed, and that totally is bad. It's bad for the people that the left should want to protect. So I would confront them on all fronts on this argument, and it's totally at the heart of what happened in this city. Now it's not the only reason. It's not just cigarette taxes that caused this to happen. Of course, it has to do with racism in the police departments. Of course, it has to do with bad incentives for cops. Absolutely, all those things. But and this is where libertarians and me specifically differs, I think, from the left. I acknowledge that racism is a much loftier thing to address. It has many causes. It's tangled up in the social web. You can't just. It's hard to design a specific policy to fix that. Whereas you actually could just take ridiculous laws like high cigarette taxes off the books and do some good. I think the left often tries to aim for the lofty progressive social goal and favors policies to do that they run into other problems with, we should have more mandatory seminars or something about race, or we should have trigger warnings to protect people's feelings if people would say something that would offend you about race, and this is going to gradually make us a less racist society. And I think that sort of progressive social vision is not realistic, and those solutions end up having other problems and aren't really solutions anyway. So that's why it's not that cigarette taxes are the most responsible factor, but it is something we could actually fix if we changed. So that's where I think the left needs work on these issues, is recognizing let's get rid of bad laws, let's mandate some good things like dash cams or body cams and things like that. But they go awry when they try to talk about taking on the big guns of racism or something, because there's just not a good policy to just do that.
Right. So I think a couple things there. You had a lot to say. I would say for one thing, I see on the right, and probably in a lot of different spaces, the idea that racism on a societal level isn't particularly a problem. So I think that using some of these flashpoints to point out that, yes, racism is still a problem, is still something that has a lot of value, because there are a lot of conservatives, and I won't say a majority or a plurality or anything like that, but too many conservatives who think that racism is wholly not a problem in modern society right now, or that prejudice or biasing the system against the dominant socioeconomic class, which is white people, is a larger problem than a society that is prejudiced against minority classes still. And I think that that's wrong. And I think that trying to keep the discussion based around the idea that one of the root causes of a lot of these recent incidents is just straight up individual racism, backed up by systemic racism, is something that still needs to be talked about and addressed. And so trying to keep the conversation focused on that still is very important. As far as taxes goes, I have a lot to, I think, disagree with you on here. And that is, let's say, it is an issue that we have too many terrible laws, and having too many laws actually enables, a racist police force to do more damage, because a racist police force backed up by a bunch of BS laws is able to harass a minority population a lot more effectively. I mean, in the Michael Brown case, if jaywalking weren't a crime, Darren Wilson might not have even slowed down as he passed Michael Brown in his car, right? And there's a really good book called 3 Felonies a Day by, is it Gina Healy at the Cato Institute?
Yeah.
Kind of documenting how all of these laws make it almost impossible to live in society without committing crimes. I jaywalk on a daily basis, and I don't get harassed or stopped for it, for probably a wide variety of reasons, partly because I'm a white person living in Washington, D.C. But let's say, theoretically, we have a nationwide cigarette tax that is the best cigarette tax, right? That is either equivalent to a regular sales tax or slightly higher for the sin tax aspect, but still not necessarily one that's going to drive a large underground economy for cigarettes, even in New York City. I think in that situation, Eric Garner is probably going to be living on the fringes of the economy anyway, and possibly doing something illegal, maybe working in an unlicensed barbershop or something like that, which speaks to the over-criminalization aspect, but doesn't say anything specific about taxes being at the bottom of why the police initiated a confrontation with him in the first place. And so I think that there's not really anything specific to say about taxes, a little bit more to say about overcriminalization enabling a racist police department. But taxes in and of itself doesn't seem to be something that really we can take a whole lot away from in this confrontation.
Well, I agree that just taxes, no. But I think, I put like barbershop licensing on a very close pedestal to cigarette taxes, and I'm speaking more broadly, I guess, than I let on about the extent of the hurdles that the state has placed on hardworking, low income and minority people, just dozens of things, hundreds of things. So I think I think right, if conservatives or libertarians just said, "Oh yeah, we need like lower taxes," was the answer they gave to this stuff, yeah, that wouldn't go very far, because they'd be implying something, some sort of like Paul Ryan vision for America or something, I guess is like the solution we're going after here. And that's not what we should be talking about. But I do think we should be talking about over-criminalization broadly. And perhaps there are, maybe the barbershop is probably a better, a clearer example where, just let somebody try to earn a living. It's not helping anyone, except like the cartel of barbershops, to just kind of like free up that space. So I think being maybe a little more broad on the over-criminalization front than I let on. But even with cigarettes, this is clearly, whenever you stop people from having something they clearly want, you create, these problems. We see that time and time again. So what's the upside to doing this? And I guess that's like, revenue probably, but also some kind of vision of installing, like a public health improvements, which I guess it's sort of just an ideological argument to be, I oppose that as an individualist libertarian, but probably talking about it as an over-criminalization issue is the way to move forward on that.
But is fighting over-criminalization any easier of a task in this case than fighting racism? That seems, as someone who is a conservative and wants to fight the regulatory and bureaucratic state, that seems just as much of an uphill battle on a society level scale than trying to focus everyone's energies on fighting racism, which is, like you said, a massive societal and cultural undertaking that involves both public policy and culture that government doesn't affect. So I don't think that progressives who want to focus the energy created by these injustices want to focus on racism. I don't think that that's necessarily any worse of a use of our energies than fighting over criminalization in this aspect, which is kind of like just picking needles out of a haystack rather than, I would say, mobilizing a culture en masse?
Well, it is like picking needles out of a haystack, but there are a lot of needles in the haystack to pick out, and each one would make people a little better off. I mean, I don't want to be minimizing the role that institutional racism plays in all this, and the importance of, you can be. I think we always tend to, when we have conversations like this, and when you talk to people and you argue with people about like what we should be focusing, there's always the sort of what we should be focusing on approach, and then you have to step back and say, well, we can be for multiple things. We can be for multiple things at once.
Yeah.
It's not, so you definitely can and should still be, and I'm interested always to hear what, if the left has more creative, solutions for tackling like institutional racism, maybe, better, I hear like, better training of police departments, or more, to be more sensitive of race, and just, I'm more sensitive in general. And I'm not like knee jerk opposed to those things, and those things might be very good. It's just, I guess it's hard for me to imagine, overcoming all the hurdles on that front, in any way. When on the other hand, there's a strong argument that racism is, while still a very, very, very powerful reality for a lot of Americans, and a pernicious influence on our society, something, racist attitudes, I undoubtedly have diminished over, the previous decades, and are going away. And I think like culture is sort of the best erosion of that, but you'll still have outliers of racism in these police departments, probably, so that are maybe immune to some of the cultural attitude shifts, but not entirely immune. So I see that a little bit as slowly taking care of itself, but we should definitely talk about things that, so we can actually stop, racism and injustice in these departments tomorrow if we can, and we can be for that too.
All right. And I suppose, what do you see, because these protests are ongoing, it's actually really fascinating how much momentum they have maintained. Do you see this as something that is going to legitimately be taken up by either, I guess, national level politicians, I mean, like Rand Paul, and like some Democrats on the Hill, or do you think that the most movement needs to be made at a lower level, at a state level, to combat some of the issues that we've discussed?
That's a good question, and again, the answer is probably both, but I do think, states, will definitely have the bigger role to play in a lot of these, reforming their own police departments, having, making cameras more available, but there does need to be change at a larger level. Particularly to like enforcement of the drug war, of prohibition of marijuana. Because you do see states, stepping back on so many of these fronts and saying, okay, we're not going to like prioritize this anymore. But then the federal government still has it on the books, so it's very confusing for them. So the federal government will have to clarify a lot of things, and Congress should play a role. And I'm glad we have a spokesperson for this and other causes in Rand Paul doing that. But I think the states, will have to play the main role in a lot of these things, which probably shows that these protests are important because they keep people, they keep these issues in the public eye for, citizens to advocate for change. On the other hand, I think there's a case to be made in some protests do not drive sympathy for the protesters' cause. So it's not crystal clear to me that step one, huge protest. Step two, everyone gets on board with what the protesters want in a lot of these cases. But I do think, I mean, it seems to me that people are increasingly outraged about what the police are doing and want uh, the state governments and the federal governments to do something about it. But that could be my journalistic bias.
All right, yeah. I've seen a lot of kind of discussion about how the protest can be a force for good, and a lot of people, I guess, annoyed with some of the protests, though I wouldn't put myself in that category. Anyway, I think that's about all the time we have for today. So thanks for joining me, Robby.
Thanks for having me. Anytime.
And I'll see everyone next time on Blogging Heads.